Hi, everyone. On behalf of VMUG, I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, Hypervisors, the Elephant in the SOC, presented by Vali Cyber CTO and co-founder Austin Gadient. Before we begin, I have a few quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for you on demand. You will receive an email with the on-demand link, so keep an eye out for that. Second, a Q&A session will follow today's presentation. All questions will need to be entered in the question and answer section on the bottom of your screen and answered after the presentation. And lastly, there will be a short evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast. Please take a minute and let us know your thoughts on today's webcast. All right, let's get started. Austin, I will hand it over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Matt. It's good to see everyone. I'm Austin Gadient. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Vali Cyber. And today we're going to be talking about the challenges that hypervisors present to the SOC and to other security professionals, and also system administrators for ESXi and hypervisors as well. So we're going to start off by talking a lot about attacks, and then we're going to talk about defenses a little bit in the middle of the presentation, and the end of the presentation should really focus quite a bit on attacks and defenses. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and flip the slide over to the state of hypervisor security today. So if you're familiar with attacks against ESXi systems, I think you would know that the majority of them right now are ransomware attacks. The reason why ESXi gets targeted by ransomware in particular is, first, VMware and ESXi are the dominant hypervisor player out there in the market. So the reason you don't see a bunch of articles about Nutanix hypervisors getting hit with ransomware or other types of hypervisors is because, frankly, they're not as prevalent right now today, and VMware ESXi systems are more common. So attackers are going to go after the systems that are the most common because they want to go after those systems where they have the most bang for their buck when they're going after attack surface. Now, the reason to go after a hypervisor for ransomware in the first place is because hypervisors have virtual machines on them and virtual machine hard disks. And so attackers recognize that if they can encrypt the VMDKs and the virtual hard disks of VMs, then they can highly motivate an organization to pay that ransom because of the devastating level of that attack. And there's another type of attack that's started to happen in more recent years. It's less common, and it's more of a nation state level attack. And this is an attack where an adversary gets onto the hypervisor, they persist there for a long time before they launch other attacks into the network. Essentially, it's a way to gain a foothold in the network and launch further attacks out from there. An example of this sort of breach would be the MITRE breach that happened in May of 2024, which was one of these sort of dwelling attacks where the attackers existed on the hypervisor for a long time. And one of the most famous ransomware examples would be the MGM breach, which happened in October of 2023. And I think the reason why attackers also love to go after hypervisors is because before Vali Cyber, there really was no EDR or advanced security tooling for the hypervisor itself, making it a very attractive attack surface. If the attacker is able to get access, they have a very high privilege level, they can do a lot of nasty things, and they can do so unfettered by existing security tools that we're familiar with on Windows or other sorts of systems. Now, the main ways that attackers get onto systems in the first place are, first, credential compromise. So the issue with credential compromise is a system administrator's credentials get stolen, and those stolen credentials are used to typically log into vCenter. And from that vCenter attack, the threat actor is going to log in to ESXi systems over SSH, and then just download and run their malware from there. And one of the big challenges here is there's no MFA on those SSH sessions. So if the attacker is able to SSH into your ESXi host, really all they have to do is have a stolen credential, and they're able to do so. The other two issues would be misconfigurations and vulnerabilities, and these typically go hand in hand. The most common misconfiguration we see is poor network segmentation, where hypervisors are present on networks that they shouldn't be present on, and an attacker is able to access them when they normally shouldn't be able to do so. And then with vulnerabilities, you have 0 days. You also have old CVEs from unpatched systems that get exploited. And ESXi and hypervisors are very complex pieces of software. So there are new vulnerabilities and CVEs coming out every so often for these systems. Some of them are a very high impact level. Now, before we talk in detail about what Vali Cyber does and what our product does, we're really going to focus in on some attacks. So we're going to look at 3 different attacks, and each of those attacks are going to demonstrate some of these methods of compromise that we're showing here on the screen: the credential compromise, the misconfiguration, the vulnerabilities. And to start off, we're going to go with ESXi args. So ESXi args was an attack that happened in February of 2023. And in that attack, the attackers took advantage of a vulnerability from 2021 to attack systems that were publicly accessible on the internet. So this is obviously something you don't want to have with your hypervisors, having them accessible on the public internet because of attack surface that they present. And these systems were unpatched. They had a vulnerability on them that was about 2 years old, which allowed the attackers to gain access, then launch the ransomware. And there was no credentials that needed to be stolen. All the attackers had to do with this CVE from 2021 was see the system on the network, and from there, they could launch their attack. It's a remote code execution exploit, meaning that it allows the attacker to run code on the vulnerable system. So what we're going to do now is walk through what this attack actually looked like. And as we go through the attacks, the demonstrations we're going to show are pre-recorded. When we go to showing ZeroLock and the product, that'll be a live demo. But for now, we're just going to do a video because running too many virtual machines on my laptop slows things down a bit. So we're going to go ahead and start this demonstration of the SLPD exploit. And in this example, we're attacking an ESXi 6.7 system. So we can see the information about that system up there near the top. It's got 3 virtual machines on it: Gandalf, Frodo, and Gimli. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, so that's why I chose those names. What the attacker is going to do is launch a netcat listener there on the left of the screen. They're going to queue up a command, a uname-a command. This is going to tell us what type of system we're running on once we're able to run commands. Now, the exploit is going to be run on the right side of the screen. And the exploit itself, the objective of it is to launch what's called a reverse shell. So a reverse shell is essentially an outbound connection back to the attacker's netcat listener, which will allow the attacker to run arbitrary commands on the victim system. So from the attacker's perspective, they're trying to run this series of commands that we see right here: this make nod, TMP backpipe, so on and so forth. That's the series of commands that will connect back to the attacker's netcat listener. And this exploit itself is this 2-stage exploit. It's a memory corruption exploit, which means that the attacker is going to try to first leak information out of the vulnerable ESXi system. And the information that they're trying to leak is the location of code addresses on the ESXi host that they want to access to execute arbitrary code. Remember, it's a remote code execution exploit. And pretty shortly here, the exploit does take a bit of time because certain messages have to be sent to leak that data, but eventually we get this information: the libc base address, libc system address. This is essentially the address information of code that the attacker wants to execute inside of the vulnerable service. So now the attacker is going to launch a memory corruption exploit to overwrite memory and then execute arbitrary code. And you can see there on the left, the attacker's command is finally run. So we can see that uname-a command has run, and we are running, in fact, on that ESXi 6.7 host. So from here, the attacker has root level access. They can download the ESXi args ransomware, and they can run that ransomware. The ESXi args ransomware will first try to kill VMs on the host, and it will try to encrypt the VMs in their VMDKs. So if we try to do an ls command here and list out the files for this Gimli VM, we can see that all those files have been encrypted. They have that .args extension, which means they've been encrypted by the ESXi args ransomware. Now, this is a really bad day. If you're the administrator for this system, it basically means your hypervisors, or specifically your VMs, have been encrypted. If we try to run one of these VMs, we see we have this nasty error. We try to spin them all up, and we get the same error. I failed to find the file, the VMX file, and the VMDK files that are necessary to spin up those VMs. And that's because they've been encrypted by the malware. Now, that technique that the attacker used to first kill the VMs is a very common one. The reason why attackers try to kill VMs before they actually launch their malware is because they recognize that the VMDK files are going to be locked while the VM is running. So if they kill the VM process, then they can encrypt that VM. Otherwise, they won't be able to access the VMDK file itself. And that'll be something interesting for later in the presentation. Now, at the time of the exploit and at the time of the ESXi-RX campaign, Rapid7 did an analysis of systems that are vulnerable to this attack, are present on the public internet. They found about 19,000 ESXi systems that were still vulnerable to this CVE on the public internet. Again, this was February of 2023, so it was about a year and a half, 2 years from when the vulnerability was launched. And if you look at Shodan today, if you're not familiar with Shodan, Shodan is a tool that can be used to look for services on the public internet. You'll find about 20,000 ESXi systems publicly on the internet today, and some of them are in fact vulnerable to this issue. So unfortunately, I think we haven't learned from this problem as a whole group of ESXi users yet. There are still systems out there that are publicly accessible, which is not good, and they are unpatched, which is also very, very bad. So what can you do to protect yourselves from an ESXi-RX attack or something like ESXi-RX from maybe a new CVE that comes out down the line? Well, first, patching your systems is also very, very important to make sure they're protected against given CVEs. And specifically with this attack, it was going after the SLP daemon on the ESXi host. And that SLP daemon has a specific firewall rule on ESXi systems that you can enable, which will prevent it from being accessible by remote attackers. And for the most part, SLP is not something that's needed for production usage of ESXi. So it's highly recommended you apply that firewall rule to block access to the vulnerable service. And then, of course, proper network segmentation is really important. Make sure your ESXi hosts are not on the public internet. So one defense we commonly see for ESXi systems and hypervisors and really ransomware in general is the use of backups. And I am personally not a fan of solely relying on backups for recovery from ransomware. I think it's just part of the tool chain that you want to use. And the challenge with backups from a security perspective is threat actors recognize that backups are commonly used to restore ransomware or restore files that have been encrypted by a ransomware. And so what they do is they dwell on systems for an average of about 60 days before they actually launch their ransomware onto the network. That allows them to be backed up into more recent backups that exist. And so now as the defender, you have to choose, do I want to use a more recent backup that might be infected with malware, or do I want to use an older backup and risk the data loss? And then of course, the other option is, well, I could use the more recent backup, but then I'm going to have to go through a time-consuming and expensive forensics operation to make sure it really is clean of malware. And not a lot of people have time for that. So I think it's really important to have these preventative solutions in place, like patching, like a proper network segmentation to prevent the attacks in the first place. And then backups are really useful for hardware failures and those sorts of issues. And they're part of the response capability for a ransomware attack, but you can't rely on them solely, primarily because of this issue of dwell time in the network. Okay, so that's the ESXi-RX attack. The next attack we're going to talk about is the MGM breach. So the MGM breach occurred in October of 2023. It cost MGM about $100 million to restore from this attack. About 100 ESXi systems were encrypted by the attack, and MGM is now facing lawsuits over this issue. And I think the cost of this breach could end up being much larger than $100 million. Something that lawyers have recognized recently in cybersecurity is that they can launch large class action lawsuits against companies when breaches happen. And those class action lawsuits can end up being much more costly than the capital that was required to restore operations of the business in the first place. So what happened with the MGM breach? Well, it started out with a threat acting group going after the support organization at MGM. So essentially what they did is they used voice phishing. So they swapped a SIM with a captured cell phone communication, and they used AI to mimic the voice of an administrator. And they mimicked that administrator, and they asked the support desk to reset a password for a given service that admin had access to. So from there, what they did is they gained access to cloud services. They moved laterally through the network and eventually gained access to the ESXi systems themselves. And from there, they had this administrative level access because they had stolen the credentials for this administrator through phishing, through that AI-based voice that they used. And from there, they were able to log into vCenter. They were able to turn on SSH, log into the hypervisors, and launch ransomware. Now, if you're familiar with ESXi, you'll know that vCenter is the management console for ESXi hosts. And if you gain access to vCenter, especially with the right privileges, you have a lot of power over those hypervisors themselves. And so we're going to demonstrate what this last step in the attack chain really looks like. How does the attacker get access to vCenter, turn on SSH, and log into systems and launch ransomware? Because I'd say this is one of the most common sets of tactics and techniques that we see when organizations get breached in their hypervisor infrastructure. First, an administrator gets their credentials phished, then those phished credentials are used to log into vCenter and ultimately into ESXi hosts. So in this next demonstration, we're going to assume the attacker has the credentials for vCenter. So they're going to log in and they're going to go after this specific hypervisor, this .12 IP address hypervisor. And to do so, they're going to change the configuration to enable SSH. So they're going to enable the SSH service on the host. They're going to start that SSH service. And then they're going to try to encrypt this Walter White VM that's located on the ESXi system. So from here, now that SSH is turned on, the attacker can log into the host. As they log in, they can now CD to the VMFS, which is where all the VMDKs and virtual machine files are located. They can download malware onto this host. And instead of downloading malware, they actually are going to do something a little bit more advanced. I'm going to pause the video right here just to talk about it. So in the previous attack, the ESXi example, the attackers downloaded malware onto the system. They ran that malware. They used it to encrypt the virtual machines. In this example, the attacker is not actually going to download malware. They're going to use what's called a living off the land attack. A living off the land attack is also known as a fileless attack because it doesn't involve the attacker actually downloading any files onto the victim system. Instead, what they're going to do is use the tools that are already present on the ESXi host to attack the ESXi host. And so on every ESXi host, you have the following tools. You have grep, which the attacker is going to use to list out files they want to attack. You have OpenSSL, which is used to do the encryption. Then you have RM, which is used to do the deletion of files. So you can see, you can list files, you can encrypt files, you can delete files. That's all the operations you need to execute to launch a successful ransomware attack. And so what the attacker is going to do is launch that command, and we can see that the Walter White VM has been encrypted. It's got that little nuclear sign extension on it now. And if we try to run the Walter White VM, similarly to the last attack, we're not going to be able to power it on. We get a nasty error message. Now, something I do hear every once in a while from system administrators is that they follow the existing guidelines from ESXi and from Broadcom, from VMware, that you shouldn't have SSH turned on. And this is absolutely correct. You should not have SSH turned on. You should only turn on SSH for ESXi hosts if you have to do some administration at that level. The problem with these attacks is that it's very easy for the attacker to simply turn on SSH on their own and disable lockdown mode or disable some of the other protections if they have the appropriate credentials and the appropriate privileges of the network. And that's why these privilege escalation and privilege stealing, credential stealing attacks are what are so common for compromising hypervisor environments. It's because that allows the attacker to just turn off the existing defenses and then run their malware pretty much unfettered with ease. So how can you protect yourself from this sort of attack? Well, you can patch systems, which is, of course, always important. You can do proper network segmentation. But I think the fact that you have to deal with the situation where an attacker might have very similar credentials to your system administrators, it brings about the case for some sort of runtime protection, some sort of EDR or runtime protection available on the hypervisor itself to protect it specifically from ransomware attacks or other attacks that target hypervisors. So this is going to bring us to our last attack before we get into the live demo of what Vali Cyber does. That last attack is the MITRE breach. So the MITRE breach happened in May of 2024. And in this attack, again, it wasn't a ransomware attack. It was nation state level actors. They were trying to breach this environment to gain persistence in the network and launch further attacks against MITRE, which is a well-known defense contractor and a very well-respected organization in the security community. If you're not familiar with them, they do something called the MITRE attack framework, which is essentially a listing of a whole bunch of tactics and techniques that attackers leverage to breach systems. So what the attackers did once they gained access to the hypervisors in the MITRE environment is they installed a malicious VIB. And if you're not familiar with a VIB is a VMware installation bundle. It's essentially the packaging that VMware uses to install software on the hypervisor host. And there's a very specific reason why attackers would want to install malicious VIBs for persistence. And we're going to see a video here where an attacker is going to attack a more recent, more modern version of ESXi. They're going to copy over their ransomware. They're going to log in. They're going to run this ransomware, which is the Akira ransomware. They run that ransomware. We see the operation was not permitted. Now, on the right side of the screen, we see the VM kernel log. And the VM kernel log is going to show us this last message, which says exec denied file in the name of the malware not installed. So this is a protection called exec installed only that comes by default on more recent versions of ESXi, particularly ESXi 8, some ESXi 7 versions. And what exec installed only is going to do for us as defenders is it's going to prevent the attacker from running arbitrary programs on our ESXi host. Any program that runs on the ESXi host has to be installed through a VIB first. Now, what is a VIB? A VIB, as I was talking about, is an installation package. That installation package is really a tar gzip file that also contains XML data to define all the files that are located in the VIB and how those files should be installed, other information about what sorts of ESXi the VIB and supports, what versions of ESXi the VIB supports, so on and so forth. So what the attacker can do is they can try to mimic their own VIB. They can try to create a malicious VIB and then use that to install their malware and to run their malware. So in this example, the attacker has created that malicious VIB. They're going to copy it onto the ESXi host, log into the ESXi host itself, and they're going to try to install that VIB. And when they try to install it, they're going to get an error saying that it violates some rule checks. And so now what the attacker can try to do is use a -f parameter. So this is -f, it means force the install. When they try to force the install, we get another issue saying that the acceptance level for the VIB is community, and the acceptance level for the ESXi host is partner. Now, what the attacker can try to do is change that acceptance level by running a couple commands here. And they can run an ESXi command to try to set the level to community supported. This is also going to be blocked. It's going to be blocked by secure boot. So at this point, maybe the attacker's out of luck. They're stopped, all our defenses worked, and they can't really do anything to run their malware. Now, what this community supported and this partner supported level means, it's really something called an acceptance level. Acceptance level from a defensive perspective effectively has two versions. Is it signed? Is it a signed VIB, or is it not a signed VIB? Signed VIBs are explicitly signed by VMware's private keys, and that's the default on ESXi. If you want to install a VIB on ESXi, it has to be signed by VMware. Otherwise, community supported VIBs are VIBs that anybody can create, but they're not signed by Broadcom and by VMware. So if an attacker is not able to sign their VIB, because Broadcom is presumably not going to sign a malicious VIB, then what are they going to do? Well, they can read the code. And if you take a look at the code for ESXi, it's really a Python script. And that Python script runs some other Python code. And in that Python code, you'll find two really interesting functions: set host acceptance and get host acceptance. So these are the functions that are used to check the acceptance level on the ESXi host and also to set it to a specific version. And we'll notice inside of these Python functions, there's this other function run command, advanced configuration, so on and so forth. And so when we break it down, what this run command function does is it uses something called config store CLI to set the runtime configuration of the ESXi host. So what the attacker can do now is try to run similar operations to mimic the behavior of ESX CLI and bypass that check with secure boot. So now what the attacker can do is first we'll prove that it's a partner supported ESXi host. We've got the acceptance level. Now we're going to run a series of commands that will use config store CLI to set the version to community supported. And now we'll try to get the acceptance level again. When we get that acceptance level, we can see it is now community supported because of those commands that we ran as the attacker. So now we do have the ability to install that malicious fib. So we'll install our malicious fib. That fib will install successfully this time. And now we have the ability to run our malware on the host. So we're going to run that malware and encrypt data store directory. You can see the files have been encrypted. We list out some of the files in this directory. This Gimli VM has been encrypted by the Akira ransomware, and we can see that by the .akira extension on those files. So this is how an attacker can bypass existing protections on ESXi to install malicious fibs. And so something that's really important to recognize is if you can, check to make sure that you have no community supported VIBs installed on your ESXi host that haven't been installed by you or your IT administrators. If it's a community supported VIB, it wasn't installed by you, it's probably installed by threat actors. It's definitely a finding worth looking into in more detail. So what can we do to protect ourselves from this sort of breach? And I would point out that MITRE is a very sophisticated organization. They have a very great reputation in the security space. They have a lot of security experience. So if they can get breached in their hypervisor environment, what are the rest of us supposed to do? Well, we can patch, we can do network segmentation, we can follow all the guidelines that are given to us by Broadcom and other organizations about how to harden and protect our ESXi hosts. But I really think the missing piece here is runtime protection. Runtime protection for the hypervisor and EDR monitoring, protect that system from attacks and from malware. And this is exactly what Vali Cyber provides. So we provide a solution called Zero Lock that will run on any Linux-based hypervisor, including ESXi, but also Proxmox, Nutanix, Citrix, so on and so forth. And the way the solution gets deployed is with an OVA. So we give you an OVA that has a management console inside of it. That management console is used to deploy out the agents themselves. And to deploy the agents, you would download them from the management console, then upload them into VMware Lifecycle Manager. Then you essentially apply them to your ESXi host, just like a normal ESXi update. Now, the other great thing to know about Zero Lock is it can be deployed on-prem because it's an OVA. It can be completely air-gapped, so it doesn't need connection to the internet to run successfully. It can provide all of its protections with the same efficacy as a connected environment without any sort of broader internet connection. And it also has integrations into any sort of SIEM or SOAR you might be using. We recognize we are just part of the security stack. We are solving a specific problem. And so you want to have that single pane of glass that you can use to view alerts from Zero Lock alongside other security tools you might be using. And this SIEM and SOAR integration capability allows us to forward alerts and forward data onto these other ingestion and data platforms, provide you that single pane of glass. Okay, so now we'll talk about the agent itself and the value that it provides from a security perspective. Before I get into that, I will mention that it is signed by VMware. So we are not a community supported VIB. We are a VMware acceptance level. And that means we go through a CI/CD process with VMware to validate that our VIB does not cause any sort of stability or production or performance issues on ESXi. And it's a very lightweight agent. It only uses about 50 megs of RAM per hypervisor. So it shouldn't have any sort of impact on your VMs or on the hypervisor itself from a performance standpoint. Now, the first value that Zero Lock provides is SSH MFA, or multi-factor authentication for SSH. Now what we're going to do is transition over to a live demo of Zero Lock. I'm going to go ahead and log into this. A second, I got the wrong credentials. I'm going to log into the management console for ESXi, or excuse me, for Zero Lock. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the MFA credentials. So now we're logged into ZeroLock, and we can see a management console with different alerts across different categories here at the top. We can see a list of recent alerts as well, of recent alerts that have occurred on the hypervisors under protection, and an activity log, which shows us essentially the audit trail for the system. So it's information like logins or logouts. You can see that failed login that I had there. And we'll also have information about configuration and policy changes as well that show up in the activity log. Now, to start out this demo, what we're going to do is target this ESXi 7 host right here. This ESXi 7 host, I'll log into it. It's got 3 VMs on it, Frodo, Gimli, and Gandalf. So what we're going to do is try to log in to this hypervisor as if we've stolen the credentials for it. And we're going to log into the hypervisor. We're going to try to run ransomware and encrypt these VMs. I'm going to go ahead and log in. And it's going to ask me for my password, which as the attacker, I've stolen the credentials. I have that password. This is the MFA. So normally the attacker would have access to the hypervisor at this point. They could start doing whatever they wanted. But what ZeroLock provides is MFA at the SSH and at the root or shell login level. So what we're going to do is put in the username, the ZeroLock user, and we're also going to put in the authenticator code for our MFA authenticator. And I'm using a cell phone-based authenticator. I'm using Google Authenticator, but you can also use Duo or Okta or some other cell phone-based MFA authenticator as well. So you can see only after we provided that extra layer of authentication did we gain access to the host. So now what the attacker can try to do is download some ransomware and run that ransomware. And we'll go ahead and run that series of commands. So we'll run a command to download the Defray77 malware. Then we'll chmod it to make it executable, and then we'll actually run it. We run that series of commands, and we instantly get kicked off the host. So that was ZeroLock in action. That was one of ZeroLock's responses. We jump over to the alerts page, see a recent alert that got logged about a blocked executable hash. So what was this? This was the second layer of protection, the application allow listing. So what ZeroLock is going to do when it installs on your hypervisor is it will take an inventory of the applications that are on the hypervisor, and it will only allow those applications to run. So if the attacker tries to add a new program to the system, that new program is going to get blocked from running. The attacker is not going to be able to run that executable. And so we can see that in this alert that we got blocked, we also get a bunch of information about what really happened with this attack. So we drill into the alert, we can see information about the files that were created or modified. So we can see the Defray malware was created. It was then modified by that chmod command. And we also get a process tree. The process tree shows us all of the processes and programs that were used in the attack, starting from SSH, where we can see information about the login itself. We can see IP address information. We can see full command line arguments, executable hashes, and then we can see the Defray malware, which is ultimately what got flagged on. It was that new program that got added to the system. Now, if you do a traditional update through vCenter or through ESXi command line, ZeroLock is intelligent about that, can recognize legitimate updates as opposed to new malware being added to the system. So this application allow listing shouldn't interfere with your existing update or patching capabilities. All right, so now we're going to get into the next layer of protection, which is the lockdown rules. And all these different layers of protection really provide defense and depth. So this lockdown rule layer of defense is going to prevent the attacker from doing some very specific things on the host. And for this part of the demo, we're going to go after an ESXi 6.7 system. We're going to go after this ESXi host right here. And so to attack that host, we're going to use that same exploit, that same vulnerability that we showed at the very beginning of this presentation with SLP. So we've got our netcat listener set up here. We're going to run the exploit right now, and we have our uname-a command queued up and ready to go. And what this exploit is going to do is allow the attacker to access a reverse shell and run arbitrary code and programs on the system and ultimately run the uname-a command. Now, the important thing to note about lockdown rules is they provide fine-grained access control over what programs are allowed to access on the system, what files are allowed to be accessed, and what network resources are allowed to be accessed as well. And using those different protections, we can block the execution of commands that are malicious or might be associated with the behavior of bad actors. So as this exploit runs, the attacker is going to be executing that malicious buffer overflow vulnerability on the heap to gain access to the system itself. And now what we'll have is eventually the ability to run commands on the system. And so you can see the exploit is finished. Our uname-a command just ran, and we can see that we are in fact running commands on this ESXi 6.7 host. So we can do an ls, we can see all the files that are listed out, and we can start running commands. We can do a who am I. Who am I didn't return anything. That's kind of funny. But what the attacker can try to do is launch this command. What this command is going to do is try to kill a VM on the system. This VM service power off command. And remember, with ESXi, the attacker was going to try to kill the VMs first and then encrypt the VMDKs, because the VMDKs are locked while the VMs are running. So this command is what is used by ESXi to actually do that VM kill operation. And when the attacker executed that command, they got kicked off the host. So now we have to ask ourselves, why did that happen? It's because of zero lock. It's because of the lockdown rules that zero lock provides. We jump over to the alerts. You can see a new alert about a program execution, and there was an attempt to shut down a VM from the command line interface. We can see this command that was ultimately run in the process tree. This is what got flagged on by zero lock, and got flagged because of the rules that are provided by zero lock. So zero lock has lockdown rules. We have about 150 of them out of the box, and these rules each target specific malicious behavior that we want to go after, that an attacker might try to execute. What I'm going to do now is add a new rule to the system, which is about the SLP service. The reason I'm adding that new rule is because of the other capability that lockdown rules give us, which is virtual patching. So virtual patching is the ability to harden the system against exploits and prevent exploits, even if the system has an active CVE on it right now today. So what we're going to do is apply that new rule, that ESXi SLP rule. We're going to run through this exploit one more time, and we're going to see what sort of difference that new rule makes. So we'll queue up our netcat listener. We'll queue up our uname-a command. We will run the exploit. And while that exploit is running, I'll mention that the rules, like I said, we have about 150 of them out of the box. You also have the ability to create your own rules. So we could create a new rule about file access, and you can essentially fill out the form to create a rule that will prevent access to certain files on the system. And you can do that for program execution, you can do it for network access, so on and so forth. And this provides a lot of flexibility for a threat intelligence team to make their own rules, their own detections based on attacks that might be coming out. So we'll jump over to the attack again. We can see the exploit is continuing to run. And what this new rule is going to do for us is it's going to stop the attacker a little bit earlier in the attack chain. So in the previous attack that we just ran, the attacker did have the ability to run commands on the vulnerable system. And this time, when the exploit finishes up, you can see our uname-a command never actually ran. So we get no output. I tried different commands, it's not going to work. That's because the attacker never gained command line level access to the system itself. Now, if you look at the alert, we can see we got an alert generated by that ESXi SLPD rule. And the process tree is much different. It's a lot smaller. And it's smaller because the way this rule works, or this virtual patch works, is it prevents SLPD from executing shell commands. And the attacker has to execute shell commands in this exploit to be able to launch a reverse shell. So as soon as this make nod TMP command got run, that command was blocked by zero lock because it was SLP trying to launch a reverse shell. Now, the operational impact and benefit of virtual patching is pretty significant because it allows you to have systems that have CVEs or vulnerabilities, but you can still harden those systems against those vulnerabilities without doing a reboot, without interrupting operations, and allow you to handle those new CVEs and vulnerabilities on a schedule that's more amenable to your IT team and to your operations team. So it allows you to provide hardening and protection for specific vulnerabilities and freeing up your resources so that you can prioritize patching the systems at the right time. You still want to patch. You don't want to simply rely on a virtual patch alone, but it allows you to plan that patching process at a time that makes sense for your organization, rather than having to run around like your hair's on fire every time a new CVE comes out. Okay, so the final layer of protection we're going to talk about is the AI behavioral layer of protection. To show this, we're going to go ahead and log back into that ESXi 7 system. Log back in here, put in the password, go through the MFA one last time. And what the attacker is going to try to do is a more sophisticated attack that we actually saw a little bit earlier in the demo. This time, what the threat actor is going to do is a living off the land attack. So they're going to run a very similar living off the land attack to what we saw earlier, but they're going to use grep to list out the files of this Gandalf VM. They're going to use OpenSSL to encrypt them, and they're going to use RM to do the deletion. Now, this command is going to take a little bit of time to run because it's operating on some rather large files, but eventually the attacker gets kicked off the host. And I'll mention that in this attack, you can see a new alert about a ransomware attack that got launched. We can drill into that. We can see 9 files were affected. Now, this is a demo. The reason I'm allowing these files to be affected is to demonstrate this last layer of defense. But normally, what we would have in place is a lockdown rule that prevents these programs from overwriting or deleting files inside the VMFS file system. So the attacker would normally get kicked off a lot earlier. In fact, it would probably be blocked by the SSH MFA. But for demonstration purposes, we're allowing the attacker to get a little bit further to show this last capability. And we can see in this list of files that were affected that the Gandalf VMDK was in fact encrypted. It got modified and then a new encrypted version was created. We can see that that happened due to these OpenSSL and these RM commands that were run by the attack. So if we try to spin up this VM, we have this nasty red error. This is where the last capability of Zero Lock comes in, which is the easy button. It's the remediate button. So the remediate button allows us to roll back the damage from an attack. So you can see after we clicked it, the files that were modified by the attack have been restored. The files that were created have been removed. And we have essentially restored this VM back to its pre-attack state. So now what I can do is I can unregister this VM. And I can go ahead and bring it back to life by registering it again. So we have our Gandalf VM. We can see all the files are not encrypted. There it is. And this time we run it, and it spins up just fine. We don't have an error. So that rollback capability allows us to undo damage that might happen to a system in the event of a ransomware attack, in the event some files were encrypted. But remember, the attacker has to get through all these other layers of defense before they get down to that level. So there's a lot of protection that Zero Lock provides. That's why it's a defense in-depth approach. So to finish things off, I'll give a little tip to those on the call, and that is to take a look at Shodan. So we talked about Shodan earlier in the presentation, and how Shodan can be used to discover vulnerable assets on the public internet. Well, the other nice thing that you can do with Shodan, if you set up an account, which is totally free, you don't have to pay any money to set up an account, you just have to give an email address. You set up an account with Shodan, you can scan for assets belonging to specific companies. So if you work for Walmart, for example, you could look for publicly accessible network assets that belong to Walmart. And it could show you information about maybe you have some ESXi hosts or some vCenter hosts or some other systems accessible on the public internet that you don't want to have accessible, because this is the type of tool that attackers are going to use to look for your systems. And it's beneficial for defenders to be checking it out every once in a while as well. And I'll finish by saying, we don't have any sort of business relationship with Shodan. They're not giving me any money to say this. I just think it's a good tool, and it's something that folks should be aware of especially folks that are on this call. So with that, I think that concludes the presentation. We really appreciate your time today, and we're going to open it up to any questions. I think Matt is going to help read out some of the questions that might be coming from the audience.
Yes, it is time for our Q&A portion of the webcast. And as a reminder, please drop your questions in the bottom Q&A section. Austin, we have one question currently. Can Microsoft Authenticator be used?
Yes, so we support any sort of MFA provider that's typical like Okta or Microsoft Authenticator. We can even integrate with Microsoft to do the integration through Microsoft's SAML capabilities as well. So we definitely support Microsoft Authenticator as an MFA provider.
We'll give attendees a couple minutes to drop their questions. All right, we've got another one. If someone were to look up their assets in Shodan, find that they were public, what would the next step be? Is it easy to make those private?
Yeah, so the next step would be to adjust firewall or network settings to make sure they're not publicly accessible on the internet. So what I would recommend is you work with the IT team within your organization that's responsible for those assets, work with them to adjust whatever network settings might be applicable to take them off the public internet. And it's really going to depend on the size of your organization, how your organization is laid out, to figure out who the right person would be to talk to and how complicated that process might be.
Austin, any plans to support Hyper-V?
So sort of the background for Vali Cyber is that we started out as a Linux security company. We grew into the hypervisor security space as a result of that. So the core capability of our technology is Linux security and security for Linux-based systems like hypervisors. So as a result, we don't currently support Windows systems, and that's not something that's on the roadmap. We're really focused on Linux-based hypervisors, in particular ESXi right now.
Can we expect scripts to be published in Power CLI that allows us to diagnose security breaches in vSphere?
Yeah, so what I would recommend for that is taking a look at some of the CIS benchmark scripts. So CIS essentially has security benchmarks for ESXi hosts. And in those benchmarks are specific commands or scripts that you can run to check those hosts to make sure they're hardened against those vulnerabilities. So check out the CIS benchmarks for ESXi. And I think you'll be able to find some of those scripts and some of those commands that you might be looking for to make sure those systems are hardened and secure.
How is Zero Lock licensed?
So we license Zero Lock per core, and it will be based on per core of your hypervisor infrastructure. It's a very similar licensing model to what Broadcom and VMware do. If you want to get into specifics about cost or anything like that, you could reach out to sales@valicyber.com or info@valicyber.com. Basically, you could just send us the number of cores that you have, and we could get you a quote on how much that would cost based on the per core pricing. And it is volume tiered. So the more cores that you have, the less money you end up paying per core. And that's how the pricing typically works. It's per core and it is volume tiered.
Someone's asking if they can get the recording. The recording will be shared post webcast via email. So just look out for that. How do you sell it in Mexico? Is it through a wholesaler?
We would probably work through a partner to make that sale. And it depends on the size of the organization. Perhaps we would take it direct, but we do have a wonderful partnership with an organization called Remedy Street. If you're not familiar with them, they provide third-party support for systems like VMware and like ESXi. That might be a good organization for us to work with to get you access to the software in a country like Mexico. Typically, we're focused on North America for our direct sales, but depends on the size of the organization and other details like English speaking abilities, that sort of thing.
We have read several best practices guides for VMware vSphere environments. The question is, how can the end user be sure that implementations by partners and others meet the minimum requirements for hardening and assurance aspects of ESX and VCSA?
I think I would also recommend you take a look at the CIS benchmarks. And so the CIS benchmarks are kind of the gold standard when it comes to hardening your ESXi hosts. And there are the standards that VMware puts out. VMware does provide some commands that you can use to validate that your configuration of your host does meet their security guidelines. But the other thing I would really point you to would be the CIS benchmark, which can give you detailed information about each control and give you specific commands to test whether each control is in place for your hypervisors.
All right, so if there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Austin for this great presentation. And to find out more about VMUG, please visit our website, vmug.com, and check out the webcast page. Please make sure to complete the short online evaluation that will pop up as you exit the webcast and let us know how today's session went. And from all of us here at VMUG, thank you and have a great rest of your day. And thank you again, Austin.
Yep, thanks so much everyone for coming. And if you want to reach out, if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to info@valicyber.com or just head over to valicyber.com. There's a little input form where you can send us information or questions that you might have if you come up with something after the webinar. But we really appreciate your time. Hope you have a good rest of your day. And I hope your hypervisors stay very, very secure.